This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. For this special episode of the Craft Beer and Brewing podcast, brought to you interruption-free by our friends at Omega Yeast, we are gathered here in Chicago around a very big table in Suncatcher Brewing. And joining me for the podcast are Matt Gallagher. Welcome, Matt.
Hey, thanks for having me. Thanks for coming.
We've got Tom Beckman over here from Goldfinger. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks for having me.
Got Jonathan Moxie from Omega Yeast, former Perennial in Rockwell.
Always a pleasure.
And then we have the illustrious Dr. Laura Burns back on the podcast. Welcome again, Laura.
Well, thank you. What an intro.
Like I said, this one's brought to us interruption-free by the folks at Omega. Our focus on this one is going to be talking about how an interactive process has helped brewers gain information and build better beers in a very collaborative aspect. And we're also really going to talk about how brewers build character in styles that are maybe, I would say, not as well known for the character of those styles. One of the beautiful things that we see here in Chicago is that, it's a beer city, and there's a wide range of beer. There are brewers here that are brewing incredibly intense, incredibly forward, flavorful beers. You've got folks like Hop Butcher and Phase 3 that are just pushing the envelope there on hazy IPA and making really killer stuff. And there are also brewers like Suncatcher here and Goldfinger who are choosing a different pathway and making... Laura, you're looking at me. Did I say something wrong?
No, I'm just enjoying the conversation.
All right. And then there are brewers that that focus on making beautiful lager beer and building character in that. And you've got Matt here, who is at this brewery in Suncatcher, this new iteration. Obviously, we'll talk about a little bit of Matt's history, but it started in Half Acre and is now here at Suncatcher. With Suncatcher here, the approach is making very accessible, reasonably lower ABV beers, everything named after just the beer style that it is. And yet there is a character to those beers. And the idea is that they should be very drinkable. They should be very signature without necessarily being standout. They are supposed to be, it's like you want to hear a Suncatcher not be trying too hard, right, Matt?
Yeah, I think it's harking back to like the pub style beers where people are coming to enjoy some beer, but to converse with each other and not necessarily converse about the beer. Now, as a brewer, I would love everyone just nerding out about the beer, but the styles are designed to facilitate conversation, facilitate contemplation. Getting a little heady here, but straight up beers. Someone once told me beers that don't get in the way of the rest of your life. So that's kind of a little bit of the thought process here.
How about you, Tom? I mean, your focus on lager is very much about making drinkable beers that people can have more than one of. And yet, obviously, you want them to be incredibly well made. And sometimes that being well-made means you don't have to think about the beer, that it can be the experience that you want it to be.
Absolutely. I think especially in lager beer, focusing on making beers that don't get in the way of your social interactions is our primary focus. We kind of we pat ourselves on the back in the brew house about mastering some pH tweak that we did in one short part of the process, but how that translates over the bar is the most rewarding, because you see somebody, instead of just having one, they're ordering a second, a third, fourth, a liter. I mean, those are the biggest compliments that we're always seeking out.
Sure. And in this environment where, for much of the 2010s, beer was built around how can I add more flavor? How can I get, and I shouldn't say, I don't know that era is necessarily over now. I think that there are certainly brewers all over the country trying to maximize flavor intensity and build the biggest kinds of beers they can. And it doesn't mean that strategy is not valid. It just means that this craft beer world that we're in is diverse enough that all of these approaches can also be valuable. Jonathan, you at Perennial made lots and lots of very big, intense imperial stouts, and as well as some awesome mixed culture beer and a whole bunch of other things. When you went to Rockwell and started that up, as you've told me, you've particularly focused on lower ABV drinkable beers. So that was even on your mind in that kind of Rockwell context.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I think a lot of that is informed by just this fatigue around choice. There's so many different beers competing for your attention on the shelf and on the tap list. And, you don't necessarily want something that's going to blow out your senses every time you drink it. Whenever I was writing recipes, I would often describe, similar like what Tom was talking about, the grandma principle, where, the highest compliment you can get is somebody having seconds. And, if you're doing that, chances are it's going to be something like a pale ale or a well-made Helles or something like that. It's not going to be a triple dry hopped whatever. And, drink what thrills you. If that's what you want to drink, that's great. But there's also, underexplored territory in the more, surface level beers.
Sure. But that kind of brings us to, the critical, piece there. I'm curious about this. If we look at the history of brewing, major breweries all over the world, whether it's Augustiner or Sierra Nevada, over time have built character around the beers that they make. It's character that we associate with those breweries. So much of it is also connected in an interesting way to fermentation. We use Chico yeast, but that's Sierra Nevada yeast. We, the Augustiner yeast, people use Augustine, and so these things get connected in flavor, that house flavor and that connection and that character that carries through all of the beers that a brewery makes is so, tied into that. Matt, as you guys make multiple styles, but and certainly across lager and ales, how do you think about crafting some, continuous through line, through those and build a Suncatcher character to some of these beers?
Yeah, for me here at Suncatcher, most of it revolves around the raw materials. So sourcing, knowing where they're coming from, knowing who grew them, how they grew them. So, the malt, a lot of the malt comes from Sugar Creek in Indiana here. And that's kind of, you mentioned earlier, kind of sometimes intentionally limiting your options. Cause we've also been talking about how there's never been a better time to have access to brewing raw materials. The breadth of it is staggering. The choice, talking about beer choice, talk about malt choice and hop choice, yeast choice is huge. So for me, I kind of sometimes want to put the blinders on, but a way for me to, we're a small place, to be able to sort of build that character is being able to communicate where the raw materials came from to the people who are drinking the beers, if they choose to care. And you don't need to shove it down their throats, but really leaning into what do these malts from the Midwest bring? What do these hops from the Midwest bring? And then also expanding that to other areas of the country and other areas of the world, and kind of just really leaning into letting the raw material speak for themselves is kind of if I had to sum up my brewing philosophy that at Suncatcher, that's what it is really just letting the hops and the malt and the yeast kind of do their thing, let them tell the story, so to speak, and trust into what you're sourcing, and trust that it's going to end up okay.
So you mentioned malt and hops. Your yeast comes from right here in Chicago, though, right?
Yeah. It sure
we
does.
can kind of assume that from the nature of this podcast.
Yeah. We're blessed here in Chicago with a yeast supplier who is top level at every aspect. So it's been a boon for Chicago for sure. It's been a huge resource for me personally and professionally to be working with Laura and Omega Yeast.
So talk about that kind of working process. Like, you're a small brewery, you're on the brew deck, you're making these beers. This is a small brewery that has to operate in an efficient kind of way. Building some knowledge about how your fermentation is going to affect the flavor of your ales per se is, like, you don't have a giant kind of, test process for all of this. You're going live with these beers that you make. And so talk a little bit about, how you understand, how these ingredients, yeast, hops, and malt are going to work in these beers before you make them.
It's a great question. And I'd like to sum up a little bit of the philosophy too. It's a little bit of a grip it and rip it over here at Suncatcher. So just kind of go for it. A lot of times I'm brewing and I'll literally be writing the hop bill like right before the boil starts. So for me, there's something a little bit about spontaneity. I know it's been in the back of my mind. I've been thinking about it sort of subconsciously and consciously, but not necessarily committing to it. And then for me, I think, I don't know. I don't like to sit down and write a recipe. I like to just go for it. And I don't really advise that. It's not, there's a lot of downsides to doing things this way.
It just shows your comfort in making it happen right the first time, which is hard to execute on, but takes a lot of experience. Yeah,
true. I do rely on the experience, and I've already made a lot of mistakes, and kind of know where to avoid it.
You don't write a recipe until you're about to brew it?
Sometimes, yes.
That's some baller flex right there.
It's like thinking what's for dinner.
I do, and my wife Laura can certainly prove this. Like I'm not a cook at all, but I do think of it that way, of like just kind of getting into the moment. What do we got? What do I have on hand? And hopefully I ordered things correctly, that what I'm looking for. But there's a lot of last minute substitutions when I'm about to mash in, to be like, oh, I got this half a bag. I think it's going to work fine. And just kind of trusting that. And again, this is a tap room model where consistency isn't necessarily as important as it is if you're distributing beer.
Sure.
Tom, you're not operating that way.
Usually not. Although like the specific quantities, yeah, I do find myself calculating those the night before or the morning of, but the vision, the style, the direction, that's all kind of premeditated. But you had asked earlier about kind of how it is working with yeast companies and how that fits into the broader picture of other ingredients. And my experience has been with hops providers. They're very much in one lane, which is hops, and they know it very well, and they're really eager to share that information. Same with malt producers. But one thing that I've found working with Laura since the beginning is that she kind of has to think about it in the full broad context of producing a beer, because it's the yeast that's going to be interacting with all the stuff that you've done upstream. And we are totally lucky to have somebody local that you can literally email and say, hey, I'm doing a decoction brew and I was expecting better attenuation. Am I expecting more attenuation than what the yeast you are providing can actually achieve? And you have a back and forth, and you understand, you literally talk about mash as well in that context. And I think that like just harnessing that knowledge will definitely elevate your brews. So that's kind of how we interact with our yeast provider. In terms of like recipes and stuff. Yeah. I mean, we kind of have it easy because we make lagers, and lagers are about nuance, which also means that you don't color too far outside the lines anyway. So we do kind of have our building blocks, the ones that we've established at Goldfinger. And so they're never really a major departure from what we've found has worked well. Where it departs is more, and I think one of the most interesting things that we don't talk a lot about is how the brewer's palate dictates that character of the brewery. You go to big, huge breweries that have a panel and they have sensory. They've found that whatever that flavor was that they're trying to replicate, us smaller guys are just tasting what we think tastes great and hoping that there's enough people out there that also agree that it tastes great. And when there are, then it's like, hell yeah, let's keep making these. So that's how we approached it. We've had a lot of really awesome beers, and we want to make some awesome beers too, and hopefully other people like it.
Sure. Well, let's, there have to be, obviously you've got house yeast that every lager brewer works really hard to understand all of the intricacies of that house yeast that tends to be their go-to.
Yeah.
And every brewer no matter what style they're making wants to understand this. Some breweries work with a much broader range of yeasts. How often do you find yourself venturing outside of your main lager strain? And when you do that to make a specific type of beer, maybe a different type of lager that just needs a different yeast to it. Talk about that kind of, process and research and how you start to understand how that's going to work with that brew.
Yeah, I think we approach it two different ways. One, if we're doing a historic style, we did a beer late last year that was kind of a take on like maybe a American amber lager. We used some wild rice in it. And we felt that since we're sourcing all of these ingredients pretty close to the Midwest, it would be cool to use kind of an old Midwest yeast. So we sourced the yeast from a defunct brewery in Wisconsin because we thought that might add some unique character, and it certainly did. Almost beyond my preference, to be honest. I'm kind of boring in that way, that when we do occasionally venture out to other yeast strains, it's like I want to go back home. We did an interesting experiment a couple years ago, sourcing the same in theory the same strain, but from two different yeast labs. And there was definitely a difference in the character and the way the malt was expressed. Everything else was the same, fermentation schedule, everything. And again, I came back home. So you guys are lucky that I'm a loyalist here. No, yeah. I love the yeast that we use. That's our house yeast. We literally use it across the spectrum, really high ABV box to low ABV lagers.
What's the strain?
OIL 106.
Yeah. And if anybody knows how to push it to its limits, it would be you. And certainly through our communications, it was always like, you're doing what? But making kind of intentional decisions, building kind of your unique profile with that strain has been certainly, something I'd admired along the way.
What are the limits, Laura? What are the limits of Tom's experimentation?
I don't want to know.
Oh, geez. I mean, anyone knocking in at 7C is pushing the limits. So that is definitely Tom's
By the
approach.
way, we're at 6 now.
Oh, geez. Yeah.
And they're my favorite batches so far. So.
Yeah. So, in that low range of temperature, these yeast are just crawling to get going, but he's provided everything for them to really thrive. So it takes skill and for sure attention to detail. And there's everything from, the nuance of mash strategies, like how are you setting up your fermentation, and then even providing the right oxygenation rates, temperatures, conditions, just driving perfection. So very cool.
Yeah, 6?
6.
Why?
Because I don't think that I figured the yeast could handle it, and it would lead to better cold break. We could be colder for longer going into the fermenter, so we could drop that out. And also, I just like to do things slowly, and that extra half a day it takes to rise up, because we knock out at 6, we ferment at 7 to 8, depending on the beer. Just that gradual process. I think our lagers are really made from basically knockout to right before we put it in a lagering tank. Everything else is just time, and some good things happen after that, but most of what we do is setting it up in that small window of like 2 to 3 weeks. Everything else, you could argue, might not be as influential.
From a technical perspective, like what are your other considerations whenever you're knocking out that cold?
Cell count, of course, that's going to be big. Oxygenation as well. We're doing sterile air aeration. So we put a lot of air in there because obviously oxygen's like 20% or so. But also really extracting as much nutrients in the brew house as possible, where there's not a single beer that we do a single infusion mash. We're doing anything from cereal mash, step mashes, decoctions, just really trying to make sure it's the best food possible that we could offer. And letting the yeast take care of the rest.
Yeah, and I do recall back to when I was brewing with the German brewmaster and the example of pitch rates. I was trying to readjust the expectations with the lower temperatures, but it really does mean you're approaching the 1.5 to 2 million per mil per Plato. You can't get away with less than that at those temps. So, and that was our really original conversations as you were setting up is, what's reasonable as a pitch rate? What can you get away with? And you've definitely had to work with those expectations.
Yeah, we've used, I know in the past, especially if I'm disorganized, which unfortunately is pretty often, and maybe didn't order the yeast pitch in time, and usually I'm asking for more cells, so the lead time's a little bit longer. So we've settled for what you had basically ready. And I'm right, you're wrong. You need more cells. No, just kidding. It worked just fine, but I feel much better. We have our generations last a lot longer, just with our pitch rate. And I mean, we have a beer that's just ripping right now, tastes the same. It's a Gen 11. So it's been great.
Yeah. So it again, attention to detail. You can't get away with that kind of without proper yeast management and then attention to detail with pitch timing, kind of harvesting at ideal viability. Even just on those low temperatures, if you're not getting some cell growth, you tend to see an aged population over time. Getting out to Gen 11 is pretty good. Actually, excellent.
That's going down the drain next time, no, sadly.
Matt, with ale fermentations over here, I imagine it's not quite exactly the same. You're not knocking out at 6C. But how do you think about fermentation as a character driver through some of these more kind of, old schoolish or classic kind of approaches to craft beer that also have a little bit of a modern edge to them?
Yeah, it's going into Suncatcher. I had, Laura and I had a lot of discussions about what would be a good yeast to use based on what I was hoping to achieve and hoping to have a yeast strain that can do a few different things. And what I settled on was what a couple larger brewers in Chicago already use, so I can go get it exactly when I need it. Because I'm not, based on the frequency of brewing here, being able to get a few generations of yeast with attention to detail and care that Tom was just talking about is a little bit of a challenge here. So I've kind of settled on a yeast strain that is, it's a real hard worker, doesn't cause a lot of issues, provides its own character, I would say. It's not, the house yeast we use, a half acre, is more neutral than what I'm using here. And that was intentional to try to, cause we were so focused on hop flavor and aroma, or we still are. I would say we're focused on a lot of things at half acre now. But in the earlier days, it was really let the yeast get out of the way and let the hops express themselves. But with the beers I'm making here at Suncatcher, I've wanted to have more yeast character in the beer. So it's an Englishy kind of yeast that can, the beers are drying out a little bit more than I think I had intended on here, and that's a bit of a brew house issue. But the yeast is still able to do some of that heavy lifting, provide the body in a beer that is finishing at like 1.7 Plato, but it doesn't taste like water. And it's not, harsh flavors aren't coming through. It's still, the yeast is just there to like really just tie everything together.
When you think about the positive yeast flavor character, how do you describe that? Like what is it that, do you think the yeast is adding to these ales versus, say, a very, very neutral fermentation approach at Half Acre that lets just, the hops be the whole story?
Yeah, I was hoping you would not ask that question because I'm like, man, I don't really know. I can't.
You set me up for it. Yeah. You said it. Careful what you throw out there.
Yeah, I don't necessarily have the sensory verbiage to say what the yeast is providing, but obviously it's a little more estery, providing a little more fruitiness that I think can be that bridge between the malt and the hops. But yeah, I am not great in terms of, ale yeast descriptor. So I'm going to throw this over to Laura because she's having one of the beers right now. So maybe she can tell you.
Well, I think the big initial kind of conversations we had is how do I get back to these styles that I really want to brew with, more American traditional kind of, ambers, pale ales, And we did talk about Chico a lot in the beginning, and you started with Chico.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably evolved into more of this strain that can be a little bit more flexible in different styles because you can't really make bitter with the Chico strain. So having some ester profile to do a more simple executed low ABV style helps to fill the space. You're not just left with a neutral amber at that point. You're actually building on some of the malt character and accentuating some of the fruitiness. So it did end up being the right choice for you. And I think in the pub kind of theme, it certainly strikes the balance.
Yeah.
So what strain are we talking about now?
1968. Which
our extra special. So it's a kind of harks back to the Fuller's strain and builds that nice body and ester profile of that characteristic pub ale.
So, but it sounds like it's also a flexible yeast that can do more depending on how you treat it. In terms of how you go through that, are there ways you can get some different expression out of it on the cold side? Depending on what that style is that you're brewing with it.
Yeah, I'll modify the fermentation temperature. Like Tom was saying, I do like to cool in a little bit lower and kind of let it slowly get up to that temp. Summertime with my wort heat exchanger doesn't always allow me that flexibility, but you gotta work with what you got.
At least you're not going to 6C.
Yeah. Oh my. Yeah. I'm almost out of like lager brewing season here based on what my wort chiller or my wort heat exchanger can do.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, there's definitely some versatility with that strain where when you're fermenting at the lower end of the range, like, you're going to get, not a totally neutral profile, a bit of character to it, like you think like a mere pond, as we're talking about like classic Northwest Pale Ales. And then if you ferment it a bit warmer, you're going to get the full English, which is, better suited for a bitter than it is for a American pale.
Yeah, and it's so flexible. I think our early conversations, again, were haze neutral. You didn't want to build a hazy out of the...
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so it's a extremely, like, one of the lowest haze producers that we have. So it fits into the repertoire of styles. So it's a great house strain.
So Matt, like, again, like I said before, like this is a small brewery. You don't have a lot of time to work on all the, fermentation parameters for this and understand that full range, but you do have some folks that kind of know what that is here. How did you pull in some of that information and start to, build, I imagine there's a relationship here, and it sounds like a two-way street of information sharing where you can both, share what your experience is back with Laura and team, but also as you are trying something, kind of lean into some of, what they know about how that yeast functions.
Yeah, I specifically remember sitting in this room at this Bed Bath & Beyond beer garden table that we're using right now with Laura when the place was under construction, and she was very kind to come over here and talk me through, listen to me and try to parse through what I was looking for. And I still got my notebook from that day of like what we were talking about, some options that Laura threw out. And it speaks to the philosophy here that I'm trying to do at Suncatcher, which is like knowing where your raw materials come from. So as Tom already mentioned, like having Laura and Omega yeast here is just a huge resource. And I think the relationships as they build over time, they become more important, and it becomes, maybe sometimes the relationships start as a transaction, like, I want to order this. Can you supply this to me? And then as they evolve, they turn into more questions. Well, like, well, what are you thinking? What are you looking for? Or like, I'm looking for this, or this was a disaster. How can I fix it? Or how do I make sure this doesn't happen next time? So I think having, the yeast philosophy here at Suncatcher, informed by Laura, who's here in Chicago, is again, it's part of that energy that flows through the beer here. That is just about the relationships and the connectivity within beer, because it's by far the best component of our industry is the relationships. And I think it's why the industry has done so well in the last 20 years is the interconnectedness of it all.
I'd agree. And, from these conversations, I think we both get an opportunity to learn and grow. And for sure, like if you see some challenges, we're always learning. We're always trying to, improve on what we do. And, we couldn't do what we do without those meetings and kind of the connection that we have with you guys. So
it's kind of interesting to think about this world, and it's the beauty of the craft beer community as a whole, right? That thousands of brewers, 9,000 brewers across the country right now are all learning and research labs in various kinds of ways. And as long as that information moves in both of these directions, from Omega out to customers, but also from customers back in, then like we have these kind of hubs that can aggregate and collect that information, but then also, share it back out in meaningful ways that help everyone make better beer. And it's why craft beer has gotten better. You agree, Tom?
Totally agree. I think the fact that we're bringing attention to the different ingredients is what is keeping it a strong industry. I think now more than ever, people are looking for authenticity in all of their interactions throughout the day. And the fact that they can go to a place and drink a beer and understand, even if they don't know where the ingredients are sourced from, but they have confidence that whoever's creating that product does care about that, has done the research, has done the experimentation, and that they're presenting their piece of art to you. I think that's more important now than ever.
So tell me about, I'm just out of broad curiosity. Tell me about the most extreme of these use cases that you all see, Jonathan. I mean, interacting with brewers out there, you have to have seen some folks doing some kind of weird things with the things that you send them. Is there an example of one of the most extreme but successful, pieces that you have learned from brewer customers?
Do you have one that jumps out to you?
I think some of the ones that just surprise you. I think one example is using our non-phenolic Hefeweizen strain Bonanza. Like people just got weird with it. They went into all of the maltier, higher ABV styles to drive some of the isoamyl acetate production and kind of, hit a little bit more of, fruity profiles and dark styles. And those tend to clash with phenolics, but that was always like a new frontier for somebody to explore. They were just excited to see what a Hefeweizen banana could do in a dark, high ABV beer, which was fun. I mean, it's off the wall for sure, but it was pretty fun.
Sure. Any other yeast experiments that you have made in the lager space, Tom?
Early on we did I think we were one of the early ones to do the thiolized lager strain. And it was for our first anniversary beer, Polish lager.
Thanks for being along the ride with us.
Oh yeah, that was fun. It's still one of my favorite beers to ask customers about because it's incredible what sulfur does to polarize customers. We have some people who say to this day it was their favorite beer, but this thing was just a sulfur bomb. We repitched it twice. We put it in our Vienna lager recipe and made like an amber lager. I think that was the third one, so it wasn't quite as sulfury.
Actually, there's science there with Vienna malt. But, yeah.
Do share.
Yeah, what science?
So we've seen in our studies and others have supported this as well, as the malting and killing can influence the precursor amount. And the variety of barley can also highly influence that. So when you're changing your malt type, it's going to influence overall thiol production. But what we found in our sensory is the competition from malt profiles, like the character of the malt and the sensory of the malt, tends to mask some of the thiol intensity. So similar to a dry hop, you're just changing the context of how those thiols express. So Vienna malt can be a little bit of a drawback, both in thiol intensity on perception and thiol intensity on expression. So
cool.
Yeah.
Well, we definitely saw variance there. The Polish lager was Pilsner malt base. We also did a thiol fest. So we took our Märzen recipe and for our second Oktoberfest, we repitched that yeast. And personally, none of those were my favorite beers. We have not revisited that experiment since.
I'll just say as well, like, I was the customer who said it was my favorite beer ever.
You did say that. You are one of them.
And I think, there's always the individual perception, and sometimes people say, oh, thiols aren't polarizing, but I know a lot of people who don't like New Zealand hops. So thiols are definitely polarizing. And on my team, I got one of my, she's been with us, Allison, for 5 years, and she's all involved in all the strain development. And she's the person I had to hear from every time we ran an experiment that all she got was sulfur. So for sure, you're perceiving these things different than others. And, it is about, I think what you're just saying about, you're brewing to your palate, right? And I think that's important to stay true to what you feel is the best representation of Goldfinger. And if it doesn't fit within the profile and within the lines, that's totally fine. Totally fine.
All right. So I got a tale from the edge. Whenever Wiseacre was going to expand distribution to Missouri, I was talking to David Bartosk, the brewmaster owner there, about doing a collaboration, and we were being silly on text, and it was like, let's do a marshmallow Kolsch or whatever, and then he was like, no, we should do a Fartbomb style lager.
They do that a lot.
And I just kept on going, not really giving that the time of day at all. And then he calls me on the phone. He's like, I don't think you're paying enough attention to the Fartbomb style lager. I was like, well, go on. And so he's like, basically, I have this concept, and if we ever pull it off, I'm going to hang up my brewing boots. And the idea is you start by brewing an American adjunct lager, and we got some green corn from Caleb Michalke at Sugar Creek, and then you basically do everything wrong in lager brewing, like all the things that you were told not to do. You underpitch, you don't oxygenate. You ferment entirely too cold. Like my chiller was not able to get us down to 6C, but we tried. And you want to give this yeast a really bad time.
Punish it.
And just punish it, like coax out all of the off flavors that you can. And then whenever it's finally given up the ghost, you either oxygenate it, or in our case, we gave it a rough transfer over to an unjacketed thing, and then we give it a very healthy pitch of Brettanomyces, and it takes all the diacetyl and the DMS, and like it turns them into these really brilliant tropical flavors. And so we enhanced that a bit by like throwing in some Eldorado, and what we ended up with was, we called it Sense of Danger, and it was just like this really beautiful little tropical adjunct lager, where it didn't taste like a total mixed fermentation thing. But Davin's still brewing, by the way, even though we pulled it off. But it was delicious.
Fartbomb. And it's still read as a lager, not a mixed fermentation beer.
Yeah, I mean, like it was like the way the esters presented, it was more like the pineapple you get from hop character than like a Brettanomyces mixed fermentation beer.
Interesting. Obviously, not too long ago on the podcast at our CBC special live event, we talked a lot about sulfur in that kind of context. It's on a lot of brewers' minds right now, especially as we think about the way that fermentation piece interacts, with that hop, kind of character. Are there any interesting insights that you guys have seen from that? Laura, you're shaking your head. You guys have certainly, you have to think about yeast and fermentation, not just in its own, kind of silo, but in the way that it interacts across all of the pieces and all of the ingredients in brewing.
Yeah, I think the one thing, a lot of people take it for granted that lager strains are really similar a lot of the time, where maybe it's not important on what strain you're selecting. It's more on the process.
Tom just mentioned that he used the same strain from different yeast labs and
it made a difference. Yeah.
And I've heard the same thing. Like I used a dry strain and I used a liquid strain.
They're totally different.
3470, and they were just entirely different.
Yeah, totally. Because that going back to my disorganization when we first opened, it didn't occur to me that I needed 2 pitches because we were going to brew back-to-back batches. And so I was like, oh, shoot, got to find some yeast like overnight. And so our second brew, which was our original lager, Pils was our first. We had a fresh Omega yeast in our Pils, and our original was dry yeast. And it's the only time we've ever used dry yeast in our brewery. Big proponent of the fresh stuff.
Yeah. And it is about nuance in a lot of sense, but even within the fresh strains we have in our offering, we've profiled a lot of them for their fermentation performance, like, how well can they ferment cold? Also, like, how much sulfur do they produce? How much diacetyl do they produce? And there's quite a range. It's funny because everybody always kind of poo-poos on Pilsner Urquell's strain, thinks that it's diacetyl prone, and it's not. It's one of the best strains to reduce diacetyl, but people in their practices, accentuate more of that diacetyl for the customer base. It's the preference. So, it's about how you treat your strain, but there's also some of those yeast genetics that kind of play in, even yeast handling practices, like you're saying. If you're going from a liquid strain to a dry strain, there's differences. So, I think the lesson learned from us on sulfur is that it's pretty variable in the different lager strains. There's quite a bit of, high or low producers, and we're measuring primarily H2S. I think the sulfur dioxide could be a little bit more, of a positive for antioxidant scavenging capabilities, but the H2S is that reductive kind of mercaptan note, can kind of further expand into other reductive flavors, and that's not what we're going for. But there's certainly some variance across our traditional lager strains.
Laura, I'm curious about this. Are there any other underrated lager strains that you find can add character to people? I mean, and only because we're talking about it now. I think that one of the interesting things about German and Czech lager is that, you know, you have these individual house characters that have built up at breweries over use and reuse over, you know, century plus. And they have these individual characters. But, you know, even in a city, you can have, you know, each brewery has its own character because they have their own yeast. And, you know, so much here we use things that we get comfortable with. And it's really easy for a brewer like Matt, who's got a lot going on, has to wear a lot of hats, you know, to find the one thing that works. And it, you know, then you can work within the range that you have. But we have lots of crayons in this, you know, 96 color box. And, you know, and so in terms of finding ways to build character in lager, I've had that conversation with folks like Chris Loring of Notch. You know, the most boring thing that could happen in American brewing is everyone makes the same fucking lager, right?
Totally.
Like, none of us want that.
Nobody's going to make Toms because they don't want to knock out at 6C.
I'm not the only one, but we're a small club.
No, yeah, that is so true. I think that if you're talking about kind of standout lager strains, you know, there's another thing that people haven't touched on because we never really understood it until we started doing our haze research. But there's certain lager strains that can produce more haze or less haze. So especially in the more modern Pilsners, like it's nice to have a strain that doesn't produce any haze. You don't want haze on a Pilsner. I remember dry hopping my first Pilsner.
Unless you're Matt.
And people were like, well, why is it hazy? I'm like, I don't want it to be.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's some strains that we know are really, really, really low in haze production. So I think the Budvar strain is kind of interesting because it's a little bit more fruity and also pretty low in haze. Yeah, Mexican lager, same deal, like very low in haze and a little bit more, like less sulfur prone, a little bit cleaner, a little bit fruitier. Even the Augustiner is funny because it's super low for sulfur, but tradition has emphasized sulfur in that lager. But it's one of our low sulfur producers, so that's pretty fun.
What makes
too.
it a low sulfur producer?
If you measure the just over fermentation, kind of cumulative H2S production, we're just looking at the strains that produce less over the fermentation. So it can be, you know, sometimes a little bit higher in the beginning of fermentation. Sometimes there's another second peak at the tail end of fermentation. But we're looking for the lowest cumulative sulfur.
Have you ever looked into the genetics that were derived more from like the Eubayanus versus the Cerevisiae and what influence that might have on sulfur production, or of course cold fermentation tolerance, cold tolerance?
Well, some of the best research in yeast is in lager yeast. It's like lucky to us, but the cold tolerance comes from the mitochondrial DNA inheritance often. And for us, like, I think, yeah, we've sequenced all of our lager strains, and the biggest variation we see is in chromosome copy number and whether it has more or less from the Eubayanus or Cerevisiae parent. But that's definitely kind of...
And the Eubayanus meaning it was more cold tolerant than if it
often,
derived that?
It depends. There's going to be kind of alleles that, well, so genes that vary between the Eubayanus or the Cerevisiae, and that can both influence the phenotype. So whether it's, you know, multitreous uptake or flocculation or, cold tolerance, those things can vary between the different parentage, and it's a lot to tease out. But yeah, the variance within the lager genome is kind of small because we started banking those as soon as lager became a thing. Pure culture became a thing. So we didn't really get a lot of expansion in the diversity of lager strains, but we still note some considerable differences. And those can be, I guess, more impactful if you're brewing like you're brewing with more of the intention and nuance and really developing the yeast character and honing in on that yeast profile that you like.
So would you recommend we not experiment with a Saaz strain versus the Froberg strain?
Actually, that's also wildly weird because the Saaz lineage, there's some genetic studies that suggest that nobody brews with them. They were never really brought into brewing tradition.
Interesting.
So yeah, the Saaz lineage is more unexplored territory. Yep. But when I've heard of people experimenting with it, Doosan has. Talk to him, he has. Yeah. But the profile and fermentation performance is like totally off of the expectations of what we like and know about the Froberg lineage.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, we just got
nerdy.
Yeah, we got nerdy there. All right. I'm curious about other yeasts in this lager family that that work within this kind of general zone, but also may add interesting character to that. To kind of again expand the broader lexicon of brewing. Are there some where you have seen brewers find some great examples, and make some interesting lagers that are both like in the zone that people expect, but have a unique character to them as a result of that lager fermentation?
Yeah, I think that like the Augustiner strain, which is our Bayern, is a great example of that. Like it's something that gives a bit more roundness than the minerality that you get from the German Lager 1. It excels in traditional styles like a Helles, but also, does well with more modern applications like New World dry hopping. That it is a perfect complement for that. Similar but different. The Mexican lager strain that we talked about earlier, is an excellent workhorse strain. It's very neutral and fast acting, it lagers, doesn't require as much lagering to get that clean profile that you're looking for, but also really excels in a modern West Coast IPA, which obviously, low haze, but provides that like a very lean profile that will allow you to accentuate West Coast hops on a very dry base.
Tom, when you play with a little bit of modern American hops, not a bunch.
I have some Citron Mosaic in the cooler right now.
All right, I won't tell anybody. But when your lager fermentation intersects with contemporary hops, how does your practice change around that?
Yeah, we've tried 3 different approaches. So the first, what we call hoppy lagers, New Zealand lagers, they were dry hopped, super malty. They were.
You don't make West Coast pills here.
We do. We made one last year, actually.
Okay.
So.
Just like he does experiment. I mean, he's down.
I'm down.
It's just funny. I got an email yesterday from Kevin Davey, and he's like, "I hate West Coast pills. It sucks as a style. I hate it." And so, I literally did send this email last night, in fact. I hear you and respect your opinion, but you're dead wrong and I will fight you. So anyway, it's just timely.
That's funny.
Timely.
You're getting you're impeding on cold IPA.
Cold IPA,
that's what's going on
exactly.
there. It's like turf war.
I'm just saying there are varying opinions here. And
Can we just come to an agreement that a well-attenuated hoppy lager is delicious?
Yes, I agree with that.
I love all the things, but I think you all knew that about me. But anyway, sorry to distract.
No. We did attempt to make a couple of hoppy lagers with our cold fermentation. Then we did like a combination of colder with a little bit of warm exposure. Across the board, we were getting a lot more of the grassy character from the hops that we didn't necessarily like. So last year we made our first warm lager, I'll call it, which was a West Coast Pils. And I just tapped Bob from Highland Park, asked him how he makes Timbo. And we almost followed it to a T, but then we had to krausen it because I like to naturally carbonate the beers. And honestly, I think Bob should start krausening his Timbo because it was beautiful, like silky and aromatic. Not to tell the master how to make his beer, but thanks, Bob. Shout out to Bob.
When you say warm, like what is warm?
So we knocked out at 10. We fermented for a couple of days. I want to say at like 12. Let it free rise. Did the dry hop warm. Let it sit there for 48 hours. Dry hopped. Then slowly cool it down. And we got it back down to 7C. Transferred it into the lagering tank. Krausened it with some pills. At 7, let it ferment at 7 slowly for like a week in the horizontal, and then dropped it cool gradually over time and packaged it like a week later. So also not lagered for a long time.
How warm were you dry hopping that?
16.
And also that like the whole strategy of krausening on that IPA is interesting. It really, I could see there being a lot of interactions there, but curious where you saw that come in.
It was mainly, so the one thing that we had been able to do I wanted to preserve some Goldfinger aspect, and we really pride ourselves on the mouthfeel of our naturally carbonated, our spooned lagers. But obviously, dry hopping at that warm temp, we're going to blow off most of the CO2. So we debated whether or not to force carb it. And I said, well, I mean, we always have pills fermenting. Why don't we just knock out some pills into the horizontal and let it take care of it? And we got like 2.7 volumes CO2 naturally from the pills, and seriously, it was just like a pillow just on top of the beer.
There is some, I think there's some interesting terpene conversion with lager yeast that it would be, from my perspective, kind of cool to study that. How that krausening made a difference there.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, very interesting.
I will say, Jude from Hop Butcher, hearing him say, I've never smelled a mosaic expression like I have on this. Hearing that from Jude, there might be something there. And I agree with him. It was like, I don't know if it was just the crop year, but it was super blueberry. You know, there's that character. It was like a pop of blueberry.
It's funny how when something reduces, another thing expresses. So it could be some of that, you know, helping to emphasize that blueberry that you got. But cool. Interesting. One of my favorite, I don't know, I love working with Matt too. And I just wanted to talk about our recent experiment because you stumped me and I said, I don't know how to fix this, but we ended up finding something really cool out of it.
Matt, how'd you stump Laura?
Yeah.
Well, I just had a haze question. I said, the few times I've used New Zealand hops here at Suncatcher, it's just like perma haze in the beer. So after like the third or fourth time, I'm like, I think it's the New Zealand hops and not something else. So I just asked Laura and she was like, oh yeah, New Zealand hops are huge haze promoters and I don't have an answer for you. And then of course, knowing Laura, like 2 weeks later, she's like, I have an answer for you.
Yeah, because we, from a lot of our haze research, we're not just looking to promote haze, we're looking to control haze. Like it's the both ends of the spectrum. And we had some early, basically information on the knockout addition of dry hops. So early fermentation at krausen, or, as you're pitching into the tank, adding a small amount of dry hops can actually minimize haze. But we always thought that was similar to so if a hop promotes haze in late fermentation, it's not going to be great for the early addition. And that's why I was a little bit stumped with Matt. But what we ended up bringing back to the lab, testing, kind of concepting was, would Nelson actually reduce haze if it were used in early dry hop? And it did. It totally did.
It did, yeah. Yeah, it was a very small amount. Yeah, I just threw in as I was cooling into the fermenter, and the beer cleared up, and it was a huge improvement.
Yeah, so it's one of those strategies, like if you're not just, he's using haze neutral yeast. So again, the haze isn't being kind of exaggerated with the yeast selection. It's more related to the hop haze. And that's hard to tease out sometimes. But yeah, we brought it back into the lab, kind of tested it out, and then said, we think it'll work. I literally said, it might work. And then Matt was willing to go for it. And even on the addition rate, I think we were probably, it's less than 20% of the total dry hop amount. It was a very small amount that you put in early fermentation.
Yeah, it was essentially a sprinkle.
Yeah.
That small amount can just precipitate out that haze.
Yeah. So there's haze negating activity of that early addition. And it is also variety dependent. And that's what we were trying to test out with the Nelson is there enough of that haze kind of negating activity to use it in an early dry.
Negating activity. Haze promotion and haze negating in Nelson.
Yeah. I mean, there's like one thing we call yeast that don't promote haze is haze neutral because they're not actively promoting haze. And it's this haze negating activity from hops is actually reducing haze. So it's negative. It's not neutral. So it's hard to, we just need to learn by experimentation sometimes.
And there's something to it other than just the fact that it has large enough particulate matter that is pulling, that's creating those protein polyphenol complexes and then dropping them out. They get big enough to just fall out.
Totally.
There's something more than just that.
Yes, definitely more than just that. Although we do see if you early in our kind of customer complaints on not getting haze, when they were really trying to execute on haze and haze stability, a lot of the Whirlpool additions were becoming more and more and more, getting up to 1.5 pounds per barrel Whirlpool additions. And with that was a transfer into the fermentation. And we were seeing that have negative activity. So there's definitely an interesting phenomenon there that's not just about, kind of precipitation. It's an interesting hop variety dependent effect, similar to like a hop creep.
Yeah. Interesting. Wow. Sounds like more research is necessary.
Yeah, this is why, again, well, I think the exciting part about collaboration is unless you're like understanding a little bit more about what happens when it leaves your hands, you're not really learning. So in the sense of kind of community collaboration, Chicago, I think the best example is just being able to work hand in hand with people like Matt and Tom. So,
well, that kind of brings us to, I think, what will be our last question as we zoom out and look at it, in a big picture. This kind of collaborative aspect of learning from each other, of learning from the pool of craft brewers, and everyone improving the beers that we make and learning from each other, has been over the last 10 years, I think, one of the most incredible features of craft beer and a very intentional feature of craft beer.
And all having purpose and a vision for what we can do and how we contribute. Like it's important to realize like the best of our intentions translate into our future industry. And I see that really at this group here, but beyond us, worldwide, people love beer, and we just need to make the best beer we can and be kind of, honing in on our palate and understanding what we really want to be doing. So thanks guys for making kind of the vision of kind of future beer here in Chicago. It's fun part about being partners.
I think we need to talk more about the largest success of craft beer is what you just said, that in a time where it's getting a little more competitive, what seems to be coming out is people honing their practice more, of course, on the business side, which is important, but also the quality. And that's a huge win for craft beer, that if there wasn't a market for really high quality beer, we wouldn't be spending this kind of time making the beers that we're making. That's a huge win.
Yeah, I think that there's still a lot of fertile ground for people that are brewing with intention and have a very distinct point of view. It's not as easy for people that are trying to do the same thing as everyone else, and that's being a regional brewer and everybody making the same 5 styles of beer. If you are providing a point of view, you're curating as well as creating beer, like people are going to respond well to that.
Sure, Matt, you clearly have a positive view of the future. You came out of Half Acre. You've built a large production brewery and a compelling brand that's sold across the country, and then decided to open this small taproom focused over the bar thing. You're on the brew deck brewing the beers, even though someone in your position who has achieved what you have wouldn't necessarily need to put themselves back into that scenario. So obviously you love what you do and you think that there's a future and a positive future for this.
Yeah, definitely. As soon as you kind of kicked off this final question, it dawned on me. It's like, it's not necessarily peaks and valleys. It's like we're almost like in a saddle between peaks. Is maybe a rosy way to look at it, but I think we're all in agreement that beer's not going anywhere. There's something innate about beer that people are very attracted to, and I think a lot of it has to do is because everyone here and in our industry cares about it, does it for a reason, does it with intention, and just straight up cares about it. And I think the fact that people are attracted to things that other people care about, like if you're, I'm rambling, but yeah.
This is the way. I don't know if anyone else is tuning in and ready for Mando, but I am convinced we have that is a part of our soul as a brewer and a brewing community. We know where we're going.
I think that is a beautiful place to bring this to a close. Our Friday episode this week is a full-on episode with Matt, so we'll get the full Half Acre background. We'll get the Suncatcher background. Tune in for that as well. But thank you to Omega Yeast for bringing us this conversation, for supporting this. This group and this conversation was a great reason to come out here to Chicago. And I got to admit, when you proposed this idea and you're like, we could record this with Suncatcher, and I was like, let me find out how to do this one in person so I can come out here for it.
We love having you here, so come back anytime.
So it may have been the entire reason that I came to Chicago this week, but I love that good reason and excuse to come hang out with smart folks. Laura, if people want to learn more about Omega Yeast and the wide range, the range well beyond those 8 strains that so many brewers brew with, if they want to dive into that deep catalog of yeast that you all offer to people, and they want to also understand how those yeasts beyond that kind of core and typical range function and operate and could potentially add character to those beers they make, whether they're ales, whether they're lagers, where can they find you? How do they reach out? How do they take that next step with Omega Yeast?
Yeah, I think the partnerships expand beyond Chicago. So any emails, calls, your Omega contacts, and even just an info at will get a response from myself or anybody kind of ready to answer those questions. And then I would say my favorite project with Moxie is Top Crop. And we use that as an opportunity to kind of share our R&D knowledge without kind of getting into, any specific products. We're trying to provide kind of the learnings that we've had through just the experimentation. So I think, honestly, it's about time for a little interview with Matt on this experiment that we ran. But in general, it's kind of that community focus where we try to tie in what we do and how that translates.
And Top Crop is the email newsletter that I subscribe to, that I get. And I do love it when you all mention craft beer and brewing things in the Top Crop newsletter, which does happen quite a bit.
We like your stuff too.
Hey.
Yeah, so omegayeast.com and topcrop.co is where you can find all the goods.
Fantastic stuff. Well, Tom, Matt, Laura, Jonathan, appreciate you all sharing your thoughts here. Thank you to Omega Yeast. Cheers to all of you.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks.
Thank you.
Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.